So, we're going from where we left off at the beginning of scene two, um, where Aben talks about being Ma. I'm Ma, every drop of blood. And here I think this identification is the basis then for the following discussion, where Peter and Simeon say she was good to Sim and me, a good stepma's skirts. She was good to everyone. And then if we look at Aben's response to this, it's quite telling in terms of his identification and his sympathy. He's greatly moved by this. So there's this sort of a deep, authentic and deep emotional connection between him, at least in his own mind, and his mother. He gets to his feet and makes an awkward bow to each of them, stammering. So there's this sort of, I think, this sort of sense of taking responsibility for her. You know, he's identified himself as somehow the messenger of her communication. I'll be thankful to you. I'm her heir. And there's obviously, importantly here, the fact that, you know, he's making a kind of material claim for his connection with her. And so there's this sort of confusion, I think, about what that represents. You know, he sees his inheritance in terms of the sort of Dionysian feminine vitality of the elms, but one of its contravening sort of symbols is the Apollonian greed of the stones. And so in terms of connections with this, I think, he's her heir in terms of money, but also in terms of sensibility and connection. Peter said actually that she was good to Ephraim. And then Aben responds fiercely, and for that thanks, he killed her. So the intensity of his vengeful desire is extremely evident in that particular line there. You know, his hostility to her is extremely powerful. Didn't he slave Ma to death? He asks. He slaved himself to death. He slaved Slim and me to death, and you to death. Only none of us has yet died. And so there's this sense of, you know, they're living out this sort of Apollonian death in life through the repression and the punishing work regime that Ephraim inflicts upon them. Simeon says it's something driving him to drive us. So again, there's that invocation, I think, of a force beyond his control, so that he represents just as much of a fatalistic force as Aben. And he then vengefully says, wow, I'll hold him to judgment. So he uses this big biblical language against him. But again, ironically reveals one of his similarities with him. And that actually is sort of, there's something kind of factually inaccurate about this, that he's vengeful and holding him to judgment in this particular case, because, you know, he is unable to be in this position. You know, there's an inflated sense of pride, even from a person who believes deeply in this particular theology. Aben sardonically then says, what's driving you to California, maybe? So here, he's engaging with Simeon. He says, what's something? What's driving you to California? He's accusing Ephraim of materialism, you know, the same thing that is driving Simeon and Peter to go and to go and make their money and make their wealth. But I think his connection to his father, ironically, is evident in his lines, but he is unaware of this, and again, that draws attention to his connection with, I think, certainly Stanley and Birthday Party, but also Blanche, you know, their lack of awareness in their own flaws. A little further down, Aben decisively says, but it ain't that. You won't never go because you'll wait here for your share of the farm, thinking, he'll die soon. He decisively pinpoints here his own possessive streak to rid the farm of rivals. You know, there's this really hypocritical sort of accusation leveled on his part that actually it's going to be them that end up. He's sort of accusing them of the very thing that he seems to be attempting to enact at this moment in time. And that decisive behaviour, I think, shows us that he is at that time trying to protect his own interests. 2/3 belong to us, and he jumps to his feet. You've no right. She weren't your ma, it was her farm. Didn't he steal it from her? She's dead. It's my farm. So this irony here is again is a possessive streak in his personality, like Ephraim, and he deliberately says it's my farm, and he tries to take possession of this. And Simeon says, sardonically again with that sense of sarcasm, tell that to Pa when he comes. I bet you $1 he'll laugh for once in his life. He laughs himself in one single mirthless bark. So again, he represents Ephraim's life as a sort of joyless existence, only evident in his kind of monetary considerations. But he laughs himself in one single mirthless bark, so the laugh contains no real joy and is again animalized. And the irony here is that Ephraim's effect is evident in them all. You know, their covetousness, their possessive, Abin's possessive streak, Simeon and Peter's materialism, his negative impact is seen all throughout the characters. Simeon and Peter obviously identify that Abin has something against them, and year after year it's sculpted in your eye, something. And he says, "Aye," annoying exclamation that they constantly make. There's something suddenly exploded. Why didn't you never stand between him and my ma when he was driving her to the grave? So this is this sudden sense of resentment and protection, I think, importantly here. His desire to protect his mother. When he was slaving her to her grave. And then this dialogue that follows quickly between Simeon and Peter, I think, shows them how Ephraim has been keeping them occupied until their actual feeling or sensibility is destroyed. He said, you know, there's a long pause, they stare at him in surprise because he's actually articulated something that's the cause of his resentment. And then between them, they list these different tasks, the wooding, plough and hay and spread and weed and prune and milking. They simply exist through these different activities and through their manual labour, but Abin can't tolerate this and breaks in harshly, as he says here. And I think the intensity of his feeling shows that his hostility and his contrast to the way that the brothers are connected with their sort of empty labour. And then he describes the walls themselves, and he says, and making walls, stone atop the stone, making walls, till your heart's a stone, you heft up out of the way of growth upon a stone wall to wall in your heart. And this is one of those classic lines in O'Neill that has this immensely kind of poetic impact, but is rendered in this crude, almost stone-like language. And I think this laborious sort of repetition of stone upon stone is equivalent to their tasks of simple existence through repetition. until your heart's a stone, you heft up out of the ground in the way of growth onto a stone, wall to wall in your heart. So here, this metaphor of representing their hearts as a simple stone shows us that this repetitive abnegation that they've had enforced on them has actually destroyed their sensibility and their ability to experience passion. A little further down, Abin harshly says, they was chores to do, weren't they? A pause and then slowly. So here, he turns back their kind of sardonic streak on them. But also, I think there's a sort of hypocritical quality that is being exposed in his own behaviour. He is being hypocritical. Why didn't you do anything when you were 15? So his only evasive treatment here is through sarcasm. It was only after she died I came to think of it. Me cooking doing her work that made me know her, suffer her suffering. So here, there's a sense here of their connection through shared suffering. I think that's what actually connects them. And I think more than this, as Peter and Simeon do the same sort of activities, but it here promotes this deep sense of connection and empathy between mother and son. And there is this sort of shared sense of suffering and camaraderie on their part. She still comes back, stands by the stove, that in the evening she can't find it natural sleeping and resting in peace. She can't get used to being free, even in her grave. So there's this real strong sense of communication with the dead beyond the grave with Abin, that she resides, her presence still resides in the house, and Ephraim's torturous greed is given spirit and desire for revenge. So here, there's an irony in terms of it's a type of work, that keeps her trapped in the building, and it's actually, in terms of its family vengeance. But ironically, it's Ephraim's reluctance to allow these boys, or these men, an opportunity to live normally that keeps her trapped there. And the way that it's phrased as a type of work is hugely ironic. She stands by the stove. She can't find it natural sleeping and resting in peace. She can't get used to being free even in her grave. So there's this sort of labour. Her continued labour in death is ultimately what's driving her desire for vengeance and Aben's desire for vengeance on her behalf. That was what he'd done. And with vengeful passion, he says, and sooner or later I'll meddle. I'll say the things I didn't say then to him. I'll yell him at the top of my lungs. I'll see to it Marg gets some rest and sleep in her grave. So again, this huge desire this huge sense of him as a conduit for her resentment and vengefulness from beyond the grave is characterised and represented here. He sits down and relapses into a brooding silence, again, sort of meditating on the deep connection between himself and his mother. And they look at him with a queer, indifferent curiosity. There's a sense of their failure, that they recognise in him something strange. They don't really know what it is. They don't grasp him as an individual. And that, again, that sense of the failure of connection between folks is something that I think characterises all of these plays that we're studying here. But they're indifferent as well. They don't really seek to understand him in any way. After a pause, where incarnation do you suppose he went, Sip? So they're talking about the father here. And they explain where they think he's gone. And he says, it was in spring and May and sunset and gold in the west, and he drove off into it. So there's here, I think, the sense of the revelation of possessive materialistic motivation for his venture. The way that they describe it. It was spring and May and sunset and a gold in the west, and he drove off into it. So there's this, again, this sense of him being driven by monetary motivations. He yells, where you going, Pa? And he hauls up by the stone wall a jiffy. So he's up by the wall itself and repressing them from that position. His old snake eyes was glittering in the sun like he'd been drinking a jugful. There's this sense of this kind of sinister, threatening quality. And at the end, he says, don't you run away till I come back. And I think until there's been, a rightful blood heir established for the farm itself. And again, I think there's this sense of his own knowledge of his own infliction of suffering upon these men. He knows that they're going to be tempted to run away. Simeon further down says, maybe I didn't say nothing, and he says, looking kind of queer and sick, I've been hearing the hens clucking and the roosters crowing all the darn day. I've been listening to the cows lowing and everything else kicking up till I can't stand it no more. It's spring and I'm feeling damned, he says. Damned like an old bare hickory tree fit only for burning, he says. And then I calculate I must have looked a mite hopeful, for he had real spry and vicious, but don't get no fool idea I'm dead. I've sworn to live 100. And so here you look at this description here and this proliferation of various sort of forms of nature. And it's the vitality of nature in contrast to his own sterilized, starchy way of living that makes him feel like he can't actually stand it no more. So he's obviously, and that's where he uses the simile that he's like an old bare hickory tree fit only for burning. But he pledges for this to be a moment of rebirth and renewal rather than a sort of relinquishing of his ranch to his own sons. And then further down he says, I swore to live 100 and I'll do it, if only to spite your sinful greed, and now I'm riding out to learn God's message. So here there's this sense of his life with this awful sense of singular purpose, that he is busy limiting others and focusing entirely on preventing them from having his wealth that he's hoarded throughout his life and having the farm that he's created, which has this sort of unnatural, there's something deeply unnatural about that impulse against your own kin, against your own kind of flesh and blood. He says, and now I'm riding out to learn God's message. I think there's a huge sort of sense of irony here, that supposedly God's message is to deny your own sons, and I think there's possible, sort of biblical allusions here to, various Bible stories, of Abraham, particularly, of actually sacrificing his own son. And Aben scornfully says, a little further down, he says, and you get back to your plough, he says, and he drove off singing a hymn. I thought he was drunk, or I'd have stopped him going. And Aben just scornfully says, no, you wouldn't. You're scared of him. He's stronger inside than both of you put together. So there is this sort of recognition of strength and animosity in Ephraim's personality, and Aben is scornful of the brothers for sort of adhering to his dictates throughout their life. Aben says, I'm getting stronger, I can feel it growing in me, growing and growing until it busts out. And so there's this huge sense, I think, of his sort of vitalistic proliferation in strength, in contrast to Ephraim's sort of Apollonian rigidity. And that's where I think this conflict is being established, that his connection with this sort of maternal Dionysian femininity is ultimately what is sort of sprouting up and driving him into this moment of conflict with his own father. Further on the next side, he talks about going to see Min, and Min functions, I think, as this kind of surrogate or sort of temporary feminine that he connects with whilst waiting for that authentic feminine connection with Abby. And they talk, they're provoking him about Min, but she says, well, she's purdy. So here, lust and sexual awakening, I think, happens alongside this sense of sort of patriarchal vengeance, that this is partly what creates the Oedipal components to this play, is that his sexual awakening is occurring alongside his paternal rivalry. Peter says, if she ain't, she's teetering on the edge of 40. And then he desperately says, well, what do you know? All they is Simnur and then me after. So there's this maternal connection here between him and this Min woman. But here, they claim here that they've also slept with her, and so's their father. And Pa can tell you something too. He was first. Do you mean to say? And there's a huge sense of breakdown here in Aben. This huge sense of ferocious patriarchal rivalry that he experiences with his father, because his sort of inarticulacy here shows us that sense of Oedipal rivalry here between himself and Ephraim. And then Simeon says with a grin, hey, we are his heirs in everything, including sexual propensities. And so Aben's result to this is intensely, that's more to it, that grows on it, I'll burst soon. And so he's talking here about his developing vengeance. That vengeance is what's developing at this moment in time. More to it that grows on it, I'll bust soon. And then turns violent, I'll go smash my fist into her face. He pulls open the door and rears violently. So there's this enormous sense of animosity that sort of explodes out of Aben in response to this provocation of patriarchal sexual rivalry. That shows us the extreme desire for control and domination that he's going to inflict on women, purely in response to this patriarchal rivalry with his father. And Simeon then knows that they've provoked it. Maybe, but the night's warm, Purdy. By the time you get there, maybe you'll kiss her instead. So there's this sense here of desire being stronger than the violent power that he claims to be experiencing. As he leaves, he says, they both roar with coarse laughter, and Aben rushes out and slams the door. Then they go outside the front door, comes around the corner house and stands still by the gate, staring up at the sky. So there's again the sense as he leaves of looking for tranquility, of looking for peace. And Simeon and Peter have this conversation here. They identify with him with Cabot, and there's this huge sense of dramatic irony, like his poor dead spitting image, dog eat dog. So his violent, possessive streak in his personality is deliberately reflected on by the two brothers here. But then again, there's another layer of irony now where they talk about their materialism and don't realise their own connection with him. So Simeon says, aye, pause, both yawn, let's get to bed. He blows out the candle, they go in the front door, Aben stretches his arms up to the sky rebelliously. So there's this sense of desire for escape and resolution and reconciliation that Aben's constant sort of connection with the sky seems to be embodying. And then we see that furthermore with his lines here. He says, well, there's a star and somehow there's him, and here's me and that's Min up the road in the same night. What if I does kiss her? She's like tonight, she's soft and warm and her eyes can wink like a star. So the sky is this source of reconciliation, of conflict, and I think the fact that he is invoking Min through this imagery, this sort of night sky imagery, suggests that she is a sort of a channel for his connection with the feminine, that she's a temporary conduit for this sort of explosive Dionysian passion that in this particular instance is manifesting itself through in the domain of sexuality, but could just as easily simmer over into violence as it does later on in the play. Her mouth's warm, her arms are warm, and she smells like a warm ploughed field. She's pretty, so he channels this vital desire into a kind of feminized naturalism that's really important in terms of establishing this connection. She's purdy, and I don't give a damn how many sins she sinned after mine or who she sinned them with. My sins as purdy as any one of them. So he's attracted to this, I think, as some form of rebellion. But this phrase itself, sins as purdy as any one of them, is an oxymoron, I think, that shows us, again, his conflicted, tormented state as a character. His internal conflict is captured by that oxymoron. My sins as purdy as any one of them. That he is investing his sinful behaviour with a sense of actually almost aesthetic beauty because of his deep resentment for Ephraim's kind of puritanical religious dictates.